Greetings. Chapter 11 focuses on white-collar crime, occupational and corporate. Back in 1939, Edwin Sutherland presented the idea of white-collar crime when he defined it as a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. And that was really kind of the beginning of the study of white-collar crime in the academic criminology. Also, we began to clearly take note that white-collar crime is probably much more costly than street crime. So you kind of heard that saying, crime in the suites versus crime in the streets, or crime in the suites is more expensive and costly monetarily as well as health-wise than crime in the streets. And at first that doesn't seem to make sense, but then when you start thinking about it and thinking about all the possibilities of white-collar crime and the negative effects, then it becomes quite apparent that the cost may indeed be much greater. And many of these crimes that occur in the corporate setting may not even be viewed as being criminal, but may be viewed as violations of some kind of ruling or policy, and administrative fines might be the outcome. So we're much more accustomed to seeing crime in the streets, which really gets our attention, and with the white-collar crime maybe not as much, although that's been changing recently. I think really we've seen some cases that are very familiar to us now. For example, the Bernie Madoff case made international headlines for a long period of time, and you can think of the bank and loan scandals and some of the other stock crimes and things of that nature that you've certainly heard about. And then when we get down to corporate crime or organizational crime, those are crimes basically that are committed by people on behalf of their employing organization. And occupational crime are personal violations that take place for self-benefit during the course of a legitimate occupation. So you start looking at when corporations, corporate executives get together to commit crimes versus when an individual commits a crime for their own personal benefit versus the corporate benefit. It's very difficult to measure the rates of occupational and corporate crime, and also the cost, because a lot of it's hidden. And uncovering the corporate crime is extremely difficult for a variety of reasons. First, as I mentioned, it's often hidden, and sometimes the effects may not be known for years. And also, when people misbehave in corporations, instead of facing criminal penalties, they may be asked to resign, and the attempt there is to kind of make it go away. I remember talking to someone who was working in a mental health setting, and they had just hired a new supervisor who had left another position and had decent reviews, and it was found out pretty rapidly that there were some serious problems with the supervisor, and the mental health professionals discovered that rapidly and had the supervisor removed. But the question is, that supervisor engaged in illegal activities at the previous job, and the other employing agency was never notified, but instead it was kind of as if, as the person I interviewed talked about, that the employee was handed off, the supervisor was handed off, got rid of by giving him rave reviews, when actually my guess is that he probably was forced to resign based on his behaviors. There's also difficulty in compiling statistics, and we don't have a really good database of white-collar crime. And there's a variety of agencies that may investigate these crimes, and again, there may be a lot of out-of-court settlements and sealed documents. I once was looking into a case and that involved what I would consider, corporate crime in that sense, and I couldn't get any of the documents because the agency said that they were sealed. And finally, I went online, did a search, and I found one of the earlier court documents that was about, I don't know, 30, 35 pages long that told me everything I wanted to know. And I called back the agency and I said, well, I found, I think, everything I want. I just wanted to verify that. And the guy had a fit. He's like, how'd you get that hold of that? What did you do to get a hold of that? I said, aha, now you want me to be your consultant and tell you all this information. And then he calmed down a little bit, and I said, I got it off the internet. And he was shocked when I told him the website, which was one of the attorneys' website, and he thanked me for that information. I think he was probably going to contact them and ask them to remove it. My understanding is, based on the legal agreement, it should have been removed. But all these things, play out in strange ways. And of course, I had information there that very few would have access to, unless they searched for it. But they would expect that it would be sealed. Also, many of us criminologists may not have experience studying corporate crime. I can tell you, when I worked in the mental health field in forensic counseling, there were very few cases that I had that involved corporate crime or crime basically in the suites, or occupational crime even. I had a few, but not many, and many of them were, I'm sorry, the few of them I had were more likely to be embezzlement type cases at the lower level of the corporate ladder. Also, it may be difficult to get research funding to study corporate crime. Certainly, corporations aren't going to provide a lot of that or any of that. And also, there's the problems of worrying about being sued or running into libel issues or other problems if you start studying corporate crime. I once was studying sexual harassment occurring in the medical field many years ago, and part of this involved nursing staff handing out surveys to their colleagues. And I got a call from a physician who said that if I didn't stop my research, he would go ahead and have a lawsuit filed against me. And there was really nothing illegal that I was doing, but my first inclination was to worry about the nurses that were passing out the surveys. And so I talked to a couple of the nurses I was working with, and I told them of the situation and that we should probably stop because I thought their jobs could be in jeopardy. And they did. But what I did find out is that this physician was very well known at a hospital for being one that sexually harasses, and I guess he was worried that would come out in the research. Of course, his name would have been kept confidential, and the report would have not indicated the hospital nor the physician. But this kind of tells you that whole idea. Here, the sexual harasser is threatening lawsuit, worrying about, and so you kind of get that idea. And there's been other times too when I've looked into organizations, and you kind of get that idea that you're going to get a letter from an attorney if you pursue it further. So that may distract some of us criminologists from trying to study corporate crime, and it's just difficult to get in there. If you think about that. Some of the typologies are presented by your author, and there's crimes by persons operating on an individual ad hoc basis, for example, income tax violations or credit card fraud. And then continuing with Edelhertz's typology, there's crimes committed in the course of employment in violation of their duty of loyalty and fidelity to employers or clients, such as embezzlement, employee larceny, bankruptcy fraud, and payroll padding. Also, there's crimes incidental to and in furtherance of business operations but not central to its purpose, such as antitrust violations and commercial bribery. And then fourth, there's white-collar crime as a business or as a central activity. And your author provides more information in the section on professional crime. But here you have advance fee swindles, food and drug violations, and phony contests, and the like. Your author also points out some of the legal regulations that have tried to regulate the professions. A lot of professions are regulated kind of by internal rules and regulations or laws, or basically self-regulated in that sense. Obviously there's laws that apply, but for example, with the mental health field, that we have codes of ethics that we are supposed to follow, but there are also rules and laws of the state that someone practices within. But a lot of those rules and laws, I think, have been generated from the organizational ethics on what would be considered to be, competent practice or ethical practice. So you can read about some of the other legal regulations, and a lot of that may result in fines or out-of-court settlements rather than prison sentences. How do you put a corporation in prison? And so that whole idea there of, is a corporation, it's not a physical body, is it, or a person in that sense, but yet there's people that work there, and it can be set up where it's very difficult, where people do things that may be within the parameters of law, but taken together they end up creating something that causes a great deal of havoc and pain and suffering to others and becomes illegal. Occupational crime is discussed, where crimes by employees against individuals, such as the public, and some of the areas covered there include public corruption, and certainly we've heard a lot about that recently, and also private corruption. For example, commercial bribery and kickbacks where an individual personally benefits. Also, in occupational crimes, the author discusses crimes by employees against employees, and you can read about that. And then also crimes by employees against organizations, such as employee pilferage, which would include such acts as undercharging friends and family or overcharging customers and pocketing the difference. Also embezzlement, where individuals that are in a capacity of trust in an organization go ahead and take money, often to try to deal with the financial problem. Sometimes they consider themselves to be temporarily borrowing from their employer and plan to pay back, but they don't, and they may get caught. And also we see crimes by individuals or members of occupations. So for example, in medicine and law, retail and stock trading, we see this, for example, healthcare fraud, which you read about periodically in the paper, and the performance of medical procedures that are not needed, for example, in healthcare. And then in law, you'll see, that, for example, fraudulent damage claims and things of that nature. In retail, you have things like bait and switch, where a product is advertised and when you get to the store, it's gone, but there's a more expensive product that's being pushed on you. I've had that occur before, and what I found, usually you can negotiate with the retailer. Once it was in regards to a computer, and I just came out and I said, this is just clearly bait and switch. And they said, what? And I said, yeah, this is bait and switch. This is unethical. This is illegal. And terrible thing for a business to be doing. And they basically said, well, we'll give you the computer the next step up for the price of the computer you were going to. So it was a small savings maybe. but certainly the store took responsibility, and so by doing that, they did not engage in bait and switch. Also, stock trading, different types of stocks scams, and for example, insider trading. We've heard about that, and churning, which is collecting high commissions by running up sales with unnecessary buy and sell orders. The stock industry is obviously regulated, but we saw that all kinds of problems occurred, and had such a negative impact on our economy. Some of you may have seen some of those movies that came out, like I think it was The Wolf of Wall Street, and some of the others, of these corporate executives partying, drinking $1,000 bottles of wine, having um, all kinds of props and fancy things, and acting like they're living the life. Well, they are living the life of luxury and leisure, while they've ripped off thousands of people. We've kind of seen that occur in government agencies, officials, and attorneys going after them, and some of those cases. Interesting side note, I'll mention that I've worked with a lot of people over the years, that I've worked with people who were engaged in violent activities, that abused others, that tortured others, that were addicted to drugs and alcohol, that did all kinds of violent things. And I was able to work with those people without really running into conflict or problems. But the few cases where it was organizational or corporate, for some reason, it just was a terrible fit, and often butt heads, and found that I didn't work well with corporate criminals. I'm not sure why, but I would guess that it just didn't I didn't match up with them. Um, and some of that may be related to personality. Others may be related to the corporate culture. And so there's a whole bunch of examples that are given of different corporate crimes. The exploding Pinto, Ford Pinto, is one of the classic cases that you can read about. And according to your author, that was the first time in U.S. history that a corporation was charged with murder, even though Ford was acquitted. And some of you may not remember the exploding Pinto cases, but I remember that because I was around the driving age at that point in time, and had a friend actually that had a Pinto. Pintos weren't really considered cool cars for adolescents to have back then, but the real point there is not whether it was considered a cool car or not, but that there was a defect, and the Ford Motor Company ignored that, and it led to a gas tank exploding in rear-end collisions, killing and injuring severely some people. And your author says they chose profit over human lives. They could have fixed it. And that was what the debate was all about. Another case that's fascinating, that I've been following for a while now, is a historian named Edwin Black wrote a book called IBM and the Holocaust. And in that book, he argues that IBM cooperated with the Nazis to provide the technology at the time to track Jewish individuals and families, and IBM denies that that was the case. But there's a huge debate that's been raging for years now. There's supposed to be a movie out coming out on this IBM and the Holocaust, but I haven't seen it at this point in time. But that would certainly be a fascinating movie to see. We also see, in studying, for example, different genocides, or specifically in this case the Holocaust, you can see that there were multiple organizations or companies that used slave labor, or that provided devices or chemicals that led to the deaths of thousands of people. And there we look at, well, what was the corporate responsibility there? And there's a bunch of organizations that were involved in Nazi Germany and supporting that system of death and destruction. And so there's some more research coming out on that. Seems like we're starting to get a lot more as documents are discovered, or we have access to the internet and things of that nature. So you can take a closer look at that. Your author points out, for example, that in wartime trade violations by some corporations, that according to your author, Standard Oil Company shipped fuel to the Nazis, and Ford trucks were produced for German occupation troops in France, authorized by U.S. Ford executives, and that Chase Manhattan Bank did business with Nazis during the war. And so you can read about that, and you can there's a whole nother area of looking at corporate crime and how corporations will fail to accept responsibility and try to rationalize out the behavior. So that is discussed many times. That the occupational and organizational offenders do not see themselves as criminals, but see themselves as being part of conventional society and actually doing good for society. So they have all kinds of rationalizations. Remember, there's lower risk of getting prosecuted and for the crime, and so we have to deal with that situation. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more research carried out in this area. We certainly have a course on white-collar occupational crime, and so you can pursue that further if you'd like. And then, of course, I would wrap up by asking you to consider some of the theories. And again, your author points out, the whole idea of differential association theory and how that may be applied, how people may learn to engage in corporate criminal behavior and be rewarded for it, and see others doing it and model it from others and learn the strategies and techniques of doing it and avoiding detection. And so we may see that going on as well. And there's literally hundreds or thousands of cases of corporate crime that you can look at. But again, I mentioned some of the difficulties that we face, and certainly I'll wrap up by just providing one example that occurred. I asked an organization to provide me data for showing that what they did actually worked, that they were getting a lot of funding from government, and it was a treatment program, or I'm sorry, an educational program. And I asked if they could provide me with information. I said I was planning to present to my class information about that particular program and whether it was effective or not. And I said what I had found in the literature, it wasn't effective. Could you provide some? And I emailed them from an account where they really they couldn't tell who I was, as far as being a professor at UCF or a lecturer at UCF rather. And one of the first things that they came back with is, who are you? Where do you work? How do we contact you? And I left it at that, because my feeling is they're going to put me on the list of people to watch to see if they say anything negative. And then my understanding is that people who had other lecturers or professors or instructors who had said negative things about this group got letters from attorneys telling them that if they didn't keep quiet, that they would be sued. So we run into those problems as well. Corporations also do a lot of good for us, and they keep cities and communities and countries running, and they help people, no doubt. But also they can be downright criminals. They can be perpetrators. They can create havoc in a society. So it can go both ways. Or you can have organizations that on one hand help people and on the other hand harm people. Those are not mutually exclusive activities. So fascinating area, and again, you can take a whole course on this, and I'll wrap up at this point. Thank you.